Lauren Blake held Miles Carter's boarding pass between her fingertips. The scanner had just flashed green. She didn't look back at it. She looked down, peeled off a small yellow sticker, stuck it on the back of the pass, and pushed it toward him with a single finger. A valid first-class scan had just been flagged for a gate-side hold. A Tuesday morning at the end of September, the North Terminal at the Atlanta airport was already busy. The glass doors slid open and closed, over and over. The smell of hot coffee mixed with fried food. Miles Carter walked in carrying a black duffel bag, an old gray sweatshirt, jeans, faded at the knees, worn-out white sneakers, a dark-faced watch on his left wrist. No bodyguards with him, no one waiting for him at the door. 3 days ago, his investment fund had closed a deal to take control of Meridian Air. The papers were signed in a closed-door meeting. The money had been transferred. The buyer's name hadn't been made public yet. The announcement was scheduled for early next week. Miles kept his plan to fly like a regular passenger. He wanted to take one trip before his name got out. His phone vibrated in his pocket. A text from his assistant popped up on the screen. The press release was ready. The investor call schedule was waiting for confirmation. Miles typed a short reply. Hold it till Monday. The phone went back to the lock screen. He kept walking toward gate A12. On the way, he stopped at a small drink stand. The vendor smiled at a man in a blue suit. His greeting came with change placed neatly in the man's hand. Next, an older woman asked for directions to her connecting gate. The vendor just pointed over his shoulder. Without leaving the counter, Miles grabbed a bottle of water and kept going. The overhead departures board changed once. Gate A12 stayed the same. The seats near the windows were almost all taken. The first-class passengers had arrived early. A white man in a light-colored jacket walked up to the counter. Evan Price looked at the monitor, then addressed the man by his last name. The pass was scanned. "I have a nice flight," followed right after. Miles was at the back of the priority line. When it was his turn, Evan took his boarding pass to the machine. The machine let out a short beep. The screen was blue. Evan looked one more time, then placed his hand to the side. Lauren Blake walked over from the desk inside. She didn't greet the passenger by name. She took the pass from Evan's hand. She flipped it over to the back. A yellow piece of paper was peeled from the edge of the counter. She stuck it onto Miles's pass. No profile window was reopened on the screen. No call was made to the reservations desk. No confirmation slip for the change was printed. Lauren pushed the pass back toward him. "The cabin will handle it from here." Miles didn't take it right away. He looked at the counter's monitor. Seat 2A was still displayed on the line with his name. He reached out and took his pass back. "Why does anything need to be handled?" Lauren pulled another seat slip from under the counter. A thin, white piece of paper. A line of printed text ran across the middle. A seat behind the curtain. She placed it diagonally over the original pass. "There is a more suitable seat." Miles looked at the white slip of paper first. Then he looked back at his own pass. The name was still correct. The flight was still correct. Seat 2A was still printed clearly on the bottom edge. He didn't take the new seat slip. "I'll keep the seat I bought." Lauren didn't respond to that. She used one finger to push the white slip closer. Evan stood nearby, his eyes shifting from the screen to somewhere else. The line behind them began to inch forward, person by person. The scanner at the gate was still active. Lauren kept her voice just as even as before. "You can go on down." Miles took back his original boarding pass. The new seat slip remained on the counter. Lauren didn't pick it up. She didn't tear it up either. He walked through the gate with the original pass. The machine didn't show an error. The scanner light stayed green. The yellow piece of paper was still stuck to the back of the pass. The jet bridge was lit with white lights. Miles walked slowly, his left hand holding his bag. His right hand held the pass by its bottom edge. Behind him, the priority line kept moving. In the system, Seat 2A was still under the name Miles Carter. The time of the green scan was in the gate's log. The overhead camera looked straight down at the countertop. Lauren's hand. The yellow paper. and Miles's pass were all right there in the frame. Miles walked to the end of the jet bridge. The lights in the first-class cabin were already on. Seat 2A was the window seat. Someone was already sitting in seat 2B. A white man in a dark suit. A glass of sparkling water sat on the armrest of seat 2B. Miles put his bag in the overhead compartment. He sat down in seat 2A. The pass was still in his right hand. The yellow piece of paper was still stuck to the back of it. Sophie Grant walked over from the front galley. She placed a menu on the armrest of seat 2A. Her eyes stopped on the back of the pass. Her finger flipped it over to the side with the yellow paper. She picked the menu right back up. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step into the aisle for a moment." Miles looked up at her. He didn't stand up. "What for?" Sophie didn't answer the question. She looked over at seat 2B. The other man was spreading a napkin over his lap. Sophie turned back. "This seat has been flagged." Miles held the pass up to her eye level. Seat 2A was still printed clearly at the bottom. The flight number and departure time hadn't changed. Sophie didn't take out her handheld device. She didn't touch the seating chart on her tablet either. She turned and walked straight into the front galley. Miles stayed right where he was. The man in seat 2B pulled his glass a little closer. Out in the aisle, 2 more passengers had just reached the front row. They slowed down when they saw Sophie come back out with Derek Hall. Derek was holding Miles's pass in one hand. His other hand rested on the lapel of his uniform jacket. He didn't look at the seat map screen. He looked at the grey sweatshirt first. Then he looked over at seat 2B. "You need to change seats." Miles held out his hand. Derek didn't hand the boarding pass back right away. He said the first-class cabin had certain standards. Miles sat up straight in his seat. "What standards?" Derek looked over his shoulder. Another flight attendant was pouring more water for the man in seat 2B. There was no answer about the system. Nothing about a booking error. Just Derek's hand, placing the boarding pass on the tray table next to him. At the same time, he pulled the folded blanket from the armrest of seat 2A. The blanket was placed on a service cart near the galley. Miles watched his hand. He picked his boarding pass up from the tray. A woman in row 1 took out her phone. The screen lit up, held sideways. The lens was aimed straight down the aisle between the 2 front seats. Derek lowered his voice. "We have another seat. A more suitable one." Miles set the boarding pass on his knee. "I'm keeping the seat I bought." Derek turned his head toward the front galley. Sophie already had the in-flight phone in her hand. She spoke briefly to the ground, telling them a passenger was refusing to move. Neither of them opened the seating chart again. Neither of them asked the gate why his pass had scanned green. Miles put his water bottle on the floor next to his shoe. He rested both hands on the armrests. The man in seat 2B reclined his seat another notch. His fresh glass of water was set down on the tray in front of him. At the end of the galley, Nia Brooks stood still by a storage compartment. She looked from Derek to Miles's boarding pass. Then she looked over at the woman's phone, which was recording. 2 security officers boarded the plane then. Kyle Bennett was in the lead. Ryan Holt stood half a step behind and to the side. The body cams on both their chests were lit up. Kyle stopped at the edge of row 2. Derek stepped in front of them. He's refusing to follow the flight crew's instructions. Kyle looked at Miles first. Then he looked at the pass on Miles's knee. "What directive?" Derek said this seat wasn't up to service standards. Kyle asked what regulation had been violated. Derek didn't name the regulation. Sophie cut in. "This cabin is for passengers who fit the premium experience." Her voice carried clearly through the cabin. The woman in row 1 held her phone up higher. Nia left her spot by the galley. She held her hand out toward Miles. "Let me see your papers." Miles pulled a thin leather wallet from his jacket pocket. Nia looked at the name on the ID. The phone in her apron pocket buzzed. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A financial news alert was at the top of the screen. The name Miles Carter was in the headline. A small photo next to it matched the man sitting in seat 2A. Nia looked at the ID again. Then she turned to Derek. "Did you reopen the seat file?" Derek stood frozen in the aisle. Kyle turned his head to look at him. Ryan Holt lowered his eyes to the pass on Miles's knee. The yellow paper was still intact on the back. Derek didn't answer Naya's question. He just stood in the aisle, his hand still gripping the edge of the tablet. Kyle Bennett held up a hand. Chest high. Hold everything. Ryan Holt backed up to the edge of the cabin. He blocked the new stream of people boarding at the front. The woman in row 1 still had her phone at eye level. Kyle took the pass from Miles. He flipped it over. The yellow adhesive backing was still there. He looked at the seat number on the bottom edge. Then he turned to the crew's tablet. The screen was dark. There was no seat file open. There was no seat change entry on the screen. Kyle looked up at Derek. Pull up the seat file. Now. Derek touched the tablet. He swiped 3 times. The seat map appeared. The name Miles Carter was still on seat 2A. There were no notes about a seat change. No reason for the action. No supervisor code was attached. Kyle leaned his chest toward the screen. The bodycam captured the passenger's name, seat number, and seat status. Ryan took a picture of the flight code at the galley door. Naya pulled a clear plastic bag from a cabinet. She peeled the yellow sticky note off the card. The time, flight number, and row were written on the edge of the bag. Miles opened a black duffel bag. He took out a thin leather portfolio. The first page had the name of the investment fund. The next page had the name Meridian Air. Kyle looked at the first 2 pages. He handed it right back. Go back to your seat. Miles put the portfolio back in his bag. Derek and Sophie were asked to leave the forward cabin. They left through the front door. No one gave their service cart back to them. The blanket on seat 2A was put back in its place. The menu was placed back on the armrest. The first glass of water was brought out after that. The flight left the gate 47 minutes late. That number ended up in the flight log. During the 3 hours in the air, Miles opened his computer twice. The screen showed a letter to the board of directors. The first line noted the time of the green scan at the gate. The second line noted the yellow sticky note. The third line noted the statement made in the cabin. The last line noted the 4 sources of recordings that were secured. When the plane landed in Chicago, Nia didn't leave with the flight crew. A black car picked her up at a private employee exit. Miles went straight to the private tarmac. A private jet was waiting for him there. That night, the lights were still on in the executive conference floor at Meridian Air headquarters. The gate scan log was on the first monitor. A photo of the seat map was on the second monitor. A passenger's cell phone video was on the third monitor. Kyle's bodycam footage was on the fourth monitor. The plastic bag with the yellow sticky note sat in the middle of the table. The 4 recordings were synced to the same time code. Not a single copy was out of place. Miles sat at the head of the table. The company's dark blue tie lay next to his right hand. He hadn't put it on yet. He looked across 4 monitors. Then he asked a question. Who authorized changing the status of a seat that was already scanned green? No one in the room answered right away. Before sunrise, an internal incident file was opened. Derek Hall and Sophie Grant's names were removed from the crew schedule for the rest of the week. Their crew area access cards stopped working. By the next afternoon, their names were gone from the internal manifest for the Atlanta to Chicago route. Their eligibility for front cabin service was changed to suspended pending review. Their names also disappeared from the following month's assignment schedule. Those were the first signs. On Monday morning, a new system-wide procedure was signed off on. Any premium seat flagged for handling now required 4 steps. Reopen the seat record. Call the correct reservations support desk. Enter a text-based reason into the system. Get a supervisor's confirmation code before approaching the passenger. Miss 1 step, and the seat's status remains unchanged. No one was permitted to ask a passenger to leave their seat. The yellow slips at the gate were recalled that same week. All of the airline's gates received new protocol slips before the end of the month. Gate A12 was the first to be reviewed. Nia Brooks was transferred to the airline's passenger experience department. Her name appeared in the internal announcement on Monday morning. 30 days later, the Atlanta to Chicago route was used to audit all premium seat handling procedures. The initial report was 13 pages long. The first page had only 1 line. A valid seat cannot be changed to pending with a handwritten note. A year later, Miles went back to that same gate. He wore a dark suit. The company's blue tie was knotted at his collar. The agent scanned his pass. The light flashed green. There was no extra piece of paper attached. When he sat down in seat 2A, a menu was placed down first. A glass of water was set on the proper armrest. No one asked him to step into the aisle this time. Later, in Miles's office, there was a handwritten letter. It was a child's handwriting. A little girl wrote that her first flight had been peaceful. She wrote that her seat was still her seat. I think the audience needs to see a price paid in a way they can feel. A name disappears from the flight schedule. A keycard stops working. A single handwritten entry gets wiped from the entire system. What part of this did you find the most satisfying? Do you think the people in the cabin were quiet because they felt awkward? Or because they're just used to seeing things like that? If you think this is a story other people should hear, please share it. Write what you think in the comments section. Subscribe to Power Misplaced Stories to follow the next story.